Are we done, Yuka? Yeah. You are most welcome here for today's popular lecture on the topic of digital women's health. And the lecturer today is Madeline Balaam, who is coming from the MID center here at KTH. So I'm leaving the word. And I should say that if you have any questions, you're most welcome to ask questions to Madeline. But since we're filming today, I have to give you the mic so that your question is heard also on the movie. So please take the questions in the end, okay? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So thanks very much for having me. It's a great delight to be able to come here today and talk to a number of people about the work that I've been doing over the last few years on digital women's health. And before I get into the details of the work, I thought I'd just give you a bit of an introduction to who I am, the research background that I come from, and the methods that I use to give some context. So I'm an associate professor in interaction design in MID. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with the term interaction design, that means it's a set of research that's concerned with designing and developing interactions with digital technologies. And me, myself, most of the work that I do is based in the context of health and well-being, and that has been over the last 10 years. And my work normally involves kind of working with people to design digital technologies. So I take quite a lot of joy in developing creative methods to engage people in design processes and involve them in the design and development of those digital technologies. So I'm at KTH now, but I came here in September, so I've been here for a few months. And I'm going to talk then about the research really that I've been doing prior to coming here at Newcastle University. But this work is ongoing. It's recently funded by a VR starting grant, so I have 4 years of funding to keep working on digital women's health, which obviously I'm delighted about. So what I'm hoping, in part, by giving this talk is that I can find some interdisciplinary collaborators and people with interesting projects or technologies to work with in the space of digital women's health. So digital women's health is like super interesting to me for a number of research reasons, but also I find it a very exciting research agenda because it relates to some of the sustainable development goals. So we're talking about research that can directly contribute to goals around empowerment and equality for women and girls across the world. And you'll find then that the research methods I use and the research technologies that I use are kind of grounded in this desire to have impact not only in 50 years' time, but also now. So a lot of the technologies that I'm going to talk about are pretty mundane. They're things developed for smartphones and other very easily available and now cheap and accessible technologies for many around the globe. And I tend to work in this kind of material because not only do I know it's accessible for many, but also it means that the deployments that I do with these technologies can happen over the long term. So that means I can understand through the deployment of these technologies how people interact with them and then what the impact of this is on a particular issue or an element of social or cultural implications. So let's get on with it then. My first kind of argument is I believe that digital technologies are inherently intimate. And I'm in particular talking about the smartphone. It's something that we use almost every day. It's something that's often worn close to or held close to the body. It's something that holds many deep and dark secrets about us, or it could do if someone were to put together all the data that it gathers in its daily interactions with us. It mediates intimate interactions between ourselves and our loved ones, and we often use it in intimate settings. And I'm not going to ask you to raise your hands, but I'm sure many of you in here have used a smartphone whilst also being on the toilet. So it is an inherently intimate technology. But it became kind of interesting to me then when I started working on this maybe 6 years ago, that there were so few interactions developed for smartphones and other digital technologies that concerned women's health. And it kind of came to a head when Apple released its health kit a few years back. And although there were many low-hanging fruits in women's health issues that the Apple Health Kit could have responded to, it failed to even provide tools by which women could monitor their menstrual cycles. So they completely overlooked half of the population's needs in terms of healthcare. And I started to think about why that might be, and then what researchers could do to try and plug in those gaps. So my kind of second argument to make is that women's health is inherently intimate. And when I'm talking about women's health, I'm of course talking about sexual and reproductive health. I'm talking about intimate partner violence, female genital mutilation, cancers that affect women such as breast and cervical, and obesity, diabetes, all which disproportionately affect women. The kinds of ways in which we work and counter these women's health experiences necessarily involve intimate body work. So we have to work with parts of the body that are related to sex, where boundaries of the body have to be penetrated, and when there is often deep-seated shame by women themselves in relation to these experiences that are inherent to womanhood. So the smartphone I find to be like really interesting technology within this context. It could offer a really useful platform by which we can really innovate on women's health experiences and services. But the applications that are available at the moment on smartphones in particular are not innovative. They tend to just deliver information to the individual woman. And women's health is often ignored. So in part, of course, this lack of diversity in the design of technologies is related to the lack of diversity in design and development teams. And there's no way of arguing against that. But I would also argue that design and development teams, these big companies, turn away from women's health because of its intimate nature, because much of the work that's concerned with women's health is related to taboo. And I find taboo quite a useful concept here. Taboo is culturally and socially defined for sure, but it's often related to issues of sex, of issues around the body, and topics that cause embarrassment and shame. So women's health then ticks the box. It's often about sex, it's often about parts of the body that are shameful or embarrassing. And so then by its very nature, I argue that for many it's an unpalatable area to be working in. So despite the global urgency for innovation in women's health, we see little attention there given by the big developers in this space. So over the last 5 years of working on this, I've realized that we ourselves as researchers working on these topics need to kind of overcome the embarrassment and taboo that comes with working on areas of the female body that are related to shame and embarrassment, but that it also opens up some really interesting research questions. How do you involve people in the design of digital technologies for some of these taboo and shameful topics? How can you involve them in conversations that support your design work? How can you design digital interactions with technology that can deal with these intimate interactions that can be used in intimate parts of the body? So LaBella is the first project that I'm going to talk about today. And one of its purposes was to try and answer some of these questions. How do we design? How do we involve people in design of intimate technologies? And what does it really mean if we start using a smartphone in other parts of the body or in relation to other parts of the body? So LaBella is a combination of a piece of underwear and a smartphone app. And when used in conjunction, LaBella will provide an anatomical model of the female intimate anatomy that a woman can then touch portions of, find out things about their body, and then learn about how to keep that part of their body fit through the pelvic lift. And I haven't got time to tell you all the story about how we came to design something that I think many people would consider a pretty basic technology. Nevertheless, it seemed, as we ran a series of workshops with women of different ages, 17 to 40, that women lacked really basic understandings of their genitalia. Some women were surprised that they had 3 holes and not 2. Some women had very basic questions about how parts of their body worked, or where parts of their body were, and how they could look after them. And so we really developed LaBella in response to this. We wanted to see the ways in which digital technology could afford this new kind of embodied understanding. But one of the things we discovered as we worked with women on these topics was the extent to which they used humor and laughter as a way of countering some of the embarrassment or taboo conversations that we were having together. Our workshops and the data that we collected are spluttered with laughter and with women telling jokes and using funny language to talk about their bodies. And so it was on those grounds that we developed and designed the interactions with LaBella to be funny or humorous. With LaBella, I don't know if it's clear, but with LaBella, you take the forward-facing camera on your smartphone, and you place it between your legs, and then you try and capture a visual marker on your underpants in order to initiate the application. The very act of putting your phone in between your legs is funny. And then within that, we also included humorous language. So we included some of the colloquial terms that people use to talk about their bodies, like the wee hole and other things that just would make it humorous, a bit funny to experience. And in deploying LaBella, we found really interesting things, like women in their 30s, one woman in her 30s, discovered where her clitoris was. So the basic anatomical knowledge was delivered by this application. And women described the experience as strange and weird, but memorable. They now felt that they understood something about their bodies that they hadn't done before. But we also asked some female physiotherapists to engage with LaBella and give it a try and tell us what they thought. And this nugget of data I found to be particularly interesting. They told us that the level of knowledge, level of information in LaBella was far too basic. There was no way that a woman, an adult woman, would not know these very simple facts about their body. But they didn't, and we knew they didn't from the data that we had collected. So from that, I started to question them, what's going on that people are not having conversations with one another? A mother is not having a conversation with her daughter about her genitalia and talking about periods or talking about how to keep yourself fit during life. What's going wrong where women won't share those details with one another? And from that, I started to think about how women's health is socially defined and socially constructed. I don't know how many of you will have seen these images on the T-Banner, but here is an artist who's trying to have a conversation with Stockholm, I would view as a very liberal city, a liberal feminist city, about menstruation, talking about how menstruation is okay. But here somebody saw fit to throw black paint over this picture, and it's the only picture in that series that has been graffitied in this way. So there's something here, something happening in society that makes it so hard for people to talk about women's bodies and women's experiences and women's health in particular. So LaBella, in a way, is a bandage on the problem. It gives an individual some information about their bodies, but it doesn't solve this inherent social stigma around the women's bodies and women's health that make it so hard to access that information in the first place. So what I started to wonder then was, like, how could we design technologies that would counter this social problem? Were there ways of looking at women's health using different forms of technology that would engage a society in conversations about women's health? And that's where I'm going to talk to you about FeedFinder. So FeedFinder is very much, probably doesn't make sense in the Swedish culture, so I have to give you a little bit of background to it first. So FeedFinder is a mobile app that allows women to find, share, and review places for public breastfeeding. Now, unlike in Sweden, in most developed countries, breastfeeding rates are incredibly low. And it's one of the places where developed countries do much less well than less developed countries in terms of their breastfeeding rates. And there are many reasons why breastfeeding is difficult for women to do in the UK and for other cultures. And one of them is around the public perception of breastfeeding. This idea that if you breastfeed in public, you're going to be judged by everyone around you. Where women worry that people are going to ask them to stop, make them stop, or do anything to make this experience uncomfortable for them. And so FeedFinder was our designed response to this. We were interested in whether it was possible for women to share information about good breastfeeding experiences to encourage women to go out and try public breastfeeding for the first time. And what we found, so FeedFinder is a super simple technology. It's just like it's like a TripAdvisor, but specifically for breastfeeding women. And we released it in 2011, 2012, I forget which year. And it's still in release today. We have thousands of users, not many in Sweden, because I notice it's not such an issue here, but thousands of users around the world, all who use FeedFinder as a way of logging their breastfeeding experiences and sharing those experiences with others. And what we found through our qualitative data analysis with women is that for some, FeedFinder was a tool that enabled them to breastfeed at all. And for others, it was a tool that enabled them to breastfeed outside the home. Therefore, breastfeeding became a viable infant feeding option for them, and they were able to breastfeed for longer as a result. Just have some water. And then we were able to collect some really rich quantitative data about women's breastfeeding experiences, quantitative and qualitative. So over the last 5 years, we have map data that describes women's breastfeeding experiences in public. And we were able to do a sentiment analysis of this data and many other kinds of analysis to understand what a woman's breastfeeding experience is like in the UK. And one thing that we found that was really interesting was that actually 89% of people who have written a review on FeedFinder about their breastfeeding experiences report it as being extremely positive. There are very few instances where women have experienced being asked to cover up, being asked to go to the toilet, or being asked to leave a premises. In fact, from our data, it seems that the UK is actually a relatively friendly place to breastfeed in public. But those are not the stories that are told about breastfeeding in the UK in the media. Almost on a monthly basis, there'll be some horror story about a woman being asked to breastfeed in the toilet, or asked to cover up, or asked to leave. And so there's this culture around breastfeeding that makes it a difficult act to do. Even though actually society embraces breastfeeding, the problem isn't there to the extent that women think it is. So in that sense then, women's health is also culturally defined. And when we design technologies that respond to women's health, we also have to think about responding to this kind of cultural need. So this is an image of Sarita, who she actually died in 2012 as a result of kind of medical negligence in Ireland. So she was, I think, 17 weeks pregnant, and she was going through a septic miscarriage. The fetus was not viable for life, but the doctors who were looking after her refused her an abortion because Ireland is a Catholic country. So although abortion, in this instance, because this was an abortion that was to save a woman's life, it would have been legal, the doctors who were serving her decided not to do it. And here we can see the ways in which culture and religion really impact upon a woman's health experiences. And actually, when you look at many of the atrocities that happen to women worldwide in terms of their health, so female genital mutilation and intimate partner violence in particular, it's clear that it's as much a cultural problem as it is a social or individual problem. In this instance, even though Sarita and her partner and friends were armed with the knowledge that it was legal for her to have an abortion because the baby was no longer viable, they couldn't compel the doctors to do that act. So it doesn't really matter how many individual interventions we put in place here. We have to change the culture around women's health also. And so here I want to talk to you about a set of work that we're currently undertaking in the Lebanon with Syrian refugees. This work is in collaboration with the American University of Beirut. And we've been working with them for about 4 years, trying to look at different ways in which we can deliver healthcare to the large numbers of refugees now living in Lebanon without an ability to work and earn money and access health in particular. So this group of women in the photo here are living in a tented settlement, and they're all seeking perinatal health care of some description. So some women are trying to become pregnant, some women are pregnant, some women are kind of living with having a baby and they need some help and support in that phase of their life. And the way that the healthcare service is set up in Lebanon at the moment is that these women need to travel some distance to a healthcare centre in order to acquire health care. And having talked with the women in these tented settlements about their experiences of going to these healthcare centres, we could see that there were kind of cultural problems arising that meant that these women were receiving inadequate healthcare services. So for many women, it's impossible for them to actually make the journey to the healthcare centre. They haven't got the means of travel or the cash needed in order to pay for themselves to travel to this place to receive healthcare services. Then for those who do eventually manage to get to a healthcare centre, they find that the doctors or the nurses are so inundated with work that they haven't got more than a couple of minutes to spend with each woman to receive services. Then the women say that if they have questions, those questions are not answered by the healthcare providers. And for many women, they don't understand the prescriptions or the healthcare advice that they've been given. So for these women, at least, travelling to the healthcare centre was a kind of useless and wasted opportunity where they didn't understand the healthcare advice that they were given and where the experience was so poor that they actually didn't want to travel, even though it could have improved their health or the health of their baby. So what we were interested in doing here then was looking at ways in which we could use digital technology to connect the women living in their centre settlement with the healthcare service providers, and whether it was possible to use the technology to kind of counter this power imbalance, whereby the women could perhaps ask the questions that they wanted to be answered and then receive some decent quality answers from the healthcare service providers. So we made use, and the technology is actually kind of complicated to describe, but essentially it's a mobile technology that can connect multiple women on a group call with a doctor. And then there are ways in which you can mute voices and add in media content to the call that can make it feel somewhat like a radio show. And we set the technology up so that the women in the tented settlements could decide between themselves what the topic of the show should be, what the topic of the conversation might be, and then what were the questions that they particularly wanted to be answered in relation to their health or that topic. And then it was our job to find somebody at the healthcare centre who would answer some of those questions and take the call with these women. And we ran this over a few weeks, and the technology is pretty glitchy, so it's not a perfect experience for anyone concerned. But we found some really interesting findings in this work. So the women, because of their experiences with doctors so far in Lebanon, have very little trust or confidence in the advice that they're given. And we found that after having used this technology and had these kind of mediated conversations with a healthcare service provider about topics of their choice, that they began to trust and have confidence in the information that was being given to them. And they also felt like the healthcare service providers were beginning to understand the constraints in which they were living. We then started to talk to the healthcare service providers about their experience with this technology. And what we found, I think, is like really useful to know. Something so simple as a mediated conversation, a mediated phone call between these two parties meant that the healthcare service providers went from thinking that the women were useless, unintelligent, uninformed, uneducated, and incapable of looking after themselves because of those reasons. They went from believing that to believing that actually the reason that the women were unable to care for themselves or for their babies was because of the context in which they were living. They started to realize that the fact that they were in a tented settlement and they had little access to money or food meant that they were unable to care for themselves. And therefore, we see this kind of shift in attitude from the healthcare service providers. That means that over time, you would hope that the kinds of advice and services that the healthcare providers were offering would improve or change. So we continue to work with this technology in this setting to see if those changes hold out and whether the healthcare services improve as a result. But sometimes it's really the practices of local or national governments that impact upon women's health. They create contexts in which there is inadequate funding or policies that fail women nationally and globally. And if you want a really good recent example of this, then you only need to look at Donald Trump's first few days in power, where he signed an act that took funding away from Planned Parenthood and other NGOs that offer information or access to abortion services. So this act not only affected women and girls living in the United States, but also women and girls living around the world, and in particular those living in the poorest world, in the poorest countries. And we know that it doesn't matter if you remove access to abortion, women are still going to seek out abortion services in the case of unwanted pregnancies. So this act does not reduce necessarily the number of women who seek those services, but instead just increases the personal risk to those women when they undertake an abortion illegally. So then, in order for women's health technologies to really make an impact, in order for them to really create change, then I would argue that these technologies need to also work at a political level. So each of these projects, to some extent, has some politics, either big P or little p, entailed in it. And I think FeedFinder is one of the clearest examples. So with the kind of cuts in public funding to many services in the UK at the moment, we see that the UK government no longer collects national data about women's breastfeeding experiences. So they no longer have a pool of evidence upon which to base their policies and practices. But FeedFinder continues to collect this information, continues to be used by people who use it to describe their right now experiences in a given location. So it's now the largest source of data about UK breastfeeding experiences between sort of 2012 and 2018. And we find that if we do certain kinds of data analysis with the qualitative review data that we've collected, that we can show all kinds of ways in which politics is intertwined with women's breastfeeding experiences. So most starkly recently, using some automated text analyses tools, we were able to find that women in areas of higher social deprivation, so areas where there were less access to social care, health care, and fewer opportunities for jobs and less wealth, had very different breastfeeding experiences than women in wealthier areas. And actually their expectations around their public breastfeeding experiences were somewhat lower, in that they solely sought a chair to sit in to breastfeed or a lockable room to sit in breastfeed, whereas women in affluent areas talked about lovely cakes and a nice garden and toys and so on. So you see these real disparities in what people's expectations are, which is sort of political and interesting. But we also find now that since it's one of the only collections of data about women's breastfeeding experiences, that local councils and national governments are looking at this data set as a means of setting their public health policies and practices. So we're slowly starting to be able to push the data that we collect and what we understand in terms of the construction of a good public breastfeeding experience into policies that then can be used by public institutions and businesses to improve women's breastfeeding experiences. And so the question that I kind of want to leave on, and maybe leave you with, to think about is to what extent is it appropriate for research to be political? So I find myself reflecting on this as a publicly funded researcher working in a public institution. Is it okay for me to take a stance and work on areas of women's health that are politically dichotomizing? Is it okay to take a side and to take a stand in an increasingly divided world? Or should researchers be activists in order to make this change happen in the world that maybe we want to see happen? Alternatively, is it appropriate instead that we remain as kind of bystanders who collect data and observe things about the world and about the changing world and its impacts on health? So I'm going to close my talk now and maybe hopefully have 15 minutes of discussion with you about the work that I've been doing and where you see research. Is it something that can be political and active, or does it need to be objective and standing there, watching? Thank you very much.
So, thank you very much for a very interesting speech, Madeline. So, do we have anyone who wants to start with any question? Or just raise a hand. Please. Yes.
To answer your question, I think it's a must that we all have to turn to be a little activists. My name is Nadine. I'm from an organization called Women on Web. We're providing telemedical abortion to anyone in the world that live in a country that safe abortion doesn't exist. Can I ask a question too? Can you talk a little bit about censorship? Because that is what we as an organization always have to go through a several loophole that sometimes is not pleasant to be able to deliver women the service.
Yeah.
So like, because sometimes, you know, like doesn't matter what you do at the end, your website might be blocked by the government. If you make something so explicit, you submit it to the iOS store, they say no. Have you any thought about this, or have you come across this kind of thing?
Yes, thank you. That's a really interesting question. So censorship is something that we've experienced both kind of in terms of working with the App Store and in terms of research. So I haven't talked about it today, but we have a project where we developed a game to support families in having conversations about sex. And we're not able to deliver that onto the App Store because of the content that it contains. It's not considered to be appropriate for that platform, which I think is really problematic, and it indicates a certain prudishness and head in the sandness of Apple in general. In particular, if you look at how Siri deals with sexual health interactions too. And then in this project, working in Lebanon, we found that censorship happened within the communities, and it is a problem that we're still trying to figure out how to work around, in that certain women were not allowed to take part in these conversations based on choices either of the matriarch in the community or a husband's choice to take the phone away. There's certain kind of access requirements that you needed to be able to take part in these conversations, and if those were limited, then those women were censored out of the conversation. And certainly we saw interactions within the community where some women felt that a disproportionate voice was given to a member of the community that wasn't being offered to other people. And so we're realizing through this design work that we have to be really sensitive about those dynamics within the community, along with designing for the kind of relationship between the healthcare service provider and the women themselves. And then in terms of research, some of this work has been extremely hard to publish. And I've argued quite recently that we're held to a higher ethical account when we work on issues around the body, around women's health and around sex and taboo issues, that people's ears prick up, and rather than working with their logic, they start to come up with all kinds of reasons why your research shouldn't be published in a particular venue. It's not science, it's not appropriate, it's too feminist, it's not feminist enough. So that's a really interesting point that you raise. I don't think we haven't thought about designing around censorship so much, but that's an interesting thing to think about for the future.
And maybe if anyone else would have questions?
Well, just raise a hand if you want to.
No, then I can continue, right? so I wonder, because my background is interaction design, and then I work with commercial, and then I went back to Thailand where I'm from, and then I started to work with women's rights. And now that's why I came to this place. So my question is like that, how is actually the communities, you know, the tech communities actually see this issue? Like, because I think that's actually possibly the, you know, because we want to have change, but we cannot have change trying to, like, every time we got censored, we have to, like, try to pull people on Facebook being angry. Yeah. You know, and that's a wave of, like, yeah, let's be angry, and then things pass, and then they censor again, and yeah, let's be angry. It's like, so how, what, because I think at this moment you will have clearly will to see, like, you know, the demographic of the tech field. How does it, because I feel like it seems like the other fields go so fast comparing to the tech field, which seems to be just talking but not implementing for real.
Not implementing stuff to deal with censorship.
Yeah. Or like, when it comes to, like, a bigger perspective, like of course maybe to find the reasons would be all about the, you know, the markets and negotiation a little bit between the government and what human rights workers do so far. But I don't know, because now I'm not actually in the tech anymore per se.
To be honest, I haven't seen much interaction design research looking at censorship as an issue. You see kind of people thinking around activism and Twitter in particular as a means of raising attention or awareness to particular issues, or then the use of Facebook and the problems of Facebook as a platform for political awareness. But I haven't seen design work that's actively trying to design against censorship. But I think it's slightly increasingly important as we enter this world of kind of false news and this dichotomy of, like, media bubbles and so on, that I imagine there will be more work coming from the community that deals with those issues, but I'm not aware of anybody focused on that right now. Thank you.
Anyone else want to comment? Yes?
So one of the hot topics right now when it comes to digital health are medical chatbots and mobile health assistants. I would like to ask you what's your opinion about it, and then related it to women's health, and if you see any potential with those technologies. Because, for instance, one of the advantages that they offer is that it can make healthcare more reachable for many. But there are many people, or like experts on healthcare, who are very skeptical also. With that. So
I think it's really interesting, actually. I have a master's student who's in the room who's currently looking at kind of chatbots as a means for receiving advice on contraception. And we ran a very small student project last semester where they proposed actually a chatbot as a means of supporting women going through menopause. So I think there are some real opportunities actually for having those more taboo or private, intimate conversations with technology that maybe you wouldn't feel comfortable having with your parent, but perhaps a well-designed conversational agent could deliver some of that information, some of that knowledge that's available on the internet for you in a way that feels very comfortable and safe. And I recently have been reading quite around how Siri and Hey Google are responding to questions on sexual health in particular, and was really fascinated to find how prudish they are in response to those questions, and how bad they are at recognizing the terms associated with sexual and reproductive health. So I think there's I think there's personally a lot of opportunity for innovation in that space and for services that are really helpful for people, but it seems like we have quite a long way to go in terms of learning about how we create a conversation for people that's comfortable, that feels safe, and that you're sure that the information that's being provided is good quality. It's one of the very interesting things we discovered working with teenagers around sexual health is that the place they get their information from now is porn. And since the internet is full of porn, we have to find ways of providing better internet-based information for people than porn. Yeah. Pardon? Or better porn, maybe. Could be better porn.
Thank you. Any more people? Just raise a hand if you want to comment. Yes?
Thanks, Madeline. Lovely talk. So there is this kind of problem with some situations in life that they get increasingly medicalised. So one that's on my mind right now is childbirth and maternity, and that there's I know midwives have a strong feeling that childbirth has been overly medicalised and taken over by doctors as opposed to other forms of seeing it. So do you think there is a danger in your work that you take what are ordinary practices that might be part of people's lives in different ways and drag it into this kind of medical world where it might get misshaped in some way?
I agree with you. I think many elements of women's health, in particular pregnancy and childbirth, are becoming increasingly risk adverse as a result of kind of medical interventions. I disagree that my research privileges a medical voice. So, for example, in FeedFinder, that's information made by women or breastfeeding supporters for breastfeeding women. There is no moderation that happens on FeedFinder. There is no local government or midwife or healthcare health visitor who has access to that data or can stop women saying certain things. And that actually has been, in some ways, problematic for us because it's meant that the NHS, or the National Health Service in the UK, is unwilling to promote FeedFinder as part of its breastfeeding support because they don't want to be in a position where a breastfeeding woman might say something libelous about a business or an institution that then is kind of proliferated on the platform. So there's a technology that's grassroots. It's for women and used by women. I think the only place where it might become a risk is in this particular deployment in Lebanon, where you're bringing together a healthcare worker with the women, and the healthcare worker is in that kind of power position where they say stuff and people believe it and act on it as a result. And but I think in some senses you could view the platform as giving women an opportunity to talk about their experiences and also share their experiences with one another. So whilst it might privilege a medical position, I think it could be designed such that, or the conversation could be designed such that the women can query what the medical practitioner is saying, or a woman can give an alternative view based on their previous experience of childbirth or so on, in order to enable some kind of criticism or critique of that information or prescription offered by a healthcare provider over the service. So no, I don't think that my work necessarily privileges the medical position, but I think platforms could be configured in certain ways to do that, but that's not my intention.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you very much for a very interesting speech again, Madeline.
Thank you.
The time is up. That clock is not exactly right. And we usually give all the lecturers a little gift apart from the sandwich. So it's about the art here at KTH. I hope you don't have it.
Yes, very relevant.
And thank you for listening, and I hope you will join our next lecture in the series. And I think it's next week. I should have the poster here. Yeah. Keep looking at the library website to find info about other lectures that we have. And I hope you enjoyed it. So thank you, and thanks again. Bye.